Hi again, it's Andrew Burke from Code School Halifax, and in this session we're going to talk about version control with something called Git. Now Git is a little bit obscure and kind of complicated, but it is really amazing once you get it working. And thankfully Visual Studio Code has some great tools that make using Git really easy. And what's great with Git is it lets you take snapshots of your code at any given point and then roll back to them at any point if you want to. So it's really useful for doing any kind of serious work, and it's a common tool that's used all over the place. So it's a really good thing to learn how to do. So first we're going to show how to install it, which can be a little bit tricky sometimes, and get it configured, and then we're going to show you how it works. Okay, so hang on, here we go. So now that we've got this page, we've got some content, we're going to start doing new things to it, is we want to make sure we can save where we're at really thoroughly so that if we make a mess, we can go back. And to do this, we start using something called version control. If you've ever played a video game, version control is a bit like a save point. It's different than undo though, because you can lock down all of your files in a project at the same time and take a snapshot of the state of the file at that time, of that project, of all the files together at the same time in a project. This is known as a commit. It's called we call it a snapshot, but it's called a commit in Git. And then you can always go back to that commit at any point that you want. So I find that super useful. It's easy when you're doing a lot of coding to make a mess, inadvertently screw something up. And using version control allows you to roll back to the last safe spot you were in. I like to think of it as a little bit like if you're trying to cross a river, by hopping from ice flow to ice flow. Once you get to one, you can sort of save and then hop again later. It's like I said, it's a bit like a save point in a video game, or it's like super undo where you can actually roll back to a lock point. Anyway, for doing this, we use a program called Git. Here you can see the Git web page. It's available at git-scm.com. Okay, and it will have also, just like with Visual Studio, there's a link right there on the page to download the latest version for whatever your platform is. Mine, I'm on a Mac, but if you had Windows, it would say Windows. If you had Linux, it would say Linux. You could download that. And the download is a little bit, it takes a while, and then especially on Windows, it asks you a ton of questions from the installer. It's a bit of an annoying thing, but that's okay. All you need to do is simply say yes to the defaults. It'll be doing a bunch of things. Git is quite complex, but we're only going to be using a tiny amount of the features that it has. So it's not going to be too complex the way we use it. Okay, so there we go. So once you get that done, there's one other step you need to do. And this is a headache for people, especially on Windows the first time. But you have to put in some extra config settings just so Git knows who you are. And the easiest way to do that is to use the terminal that's built right into Visual Studio Code. Now, once you've done all the installing and everything of Git, you may need to restart your computer, and you may need at least to restart Visual Studio Code, like quit it and reopen it again. But once you've got that, you should be able to see that Git is sort of available, where when you go into clicking on this is your version control, your source control item, this one with a little circle, sort of like a little kind of tree thing. And it should give you the option to initialize a repository. Okay, if it doesn't, you might want to restart your computer and make sure your Git was installed properly. Okay, they have a whole set of documentation you could also read about if you want. But generally you install everything, restart Visual Studio, it should all be there. It might not be. If it isn't, definitely try it again. It's a bit hairy getting it started, but it should be pretty straightforward. Okay, so, but first, before we do anything else, we want to open a terminal. Now, this is, if you're in Windows, you may be familiar with the DOS panel. This is a little bit like that. This is where you go sort of underneath all the fancy GUI, where you're actually typing little commands in. Now, the real sort of heavy-duty nerd types are often spend a lot of time typing things in the terminal. We're only going to do a tiny little bit here this time. And the thing we need to type is we need to configure things properly to start. And that is, we just have to type this. Okay, I've already done this on mine, so I'm not going to do it again. But you can see here it's git config -- that's the dash that's sort of above the P on your keyboard probably if you're typing in English. And these have spaces. Global, so -- global, space, user.name, and then in quotes, your name. Now Git isn't using this for anything, it's just using it for internal reference. And then next, after you hit, and then you hit enter and it'll do stuff. And then you want to do user email and then put your email address in. So info@codeschool.halifax or whatever, right? Okay, .com. And then hit enter again. And that's the two things that's the bare minimum you need to set up your configuration. There's lots of other configuration options, but you generally won't need them for a while. So then once you've done that, you can close that. And then you're ready to initialize your repository. So you click on that button, and it'll chew for a little bit. And if everything worked right, you should now have a little 1 next to your icon for your version control, and it'll show a list of changes. Now we've only got one file, and we've only been doing a few small things to it, so this is fairly simple. This screen might get much more complex later if you're working on a big project. But for now, you can see we have index.html, and here in the margin, it says U, which means it's untracked. Even if you roll over, it actually shows you the file and it says untracked. Okay, that's because it's not been added to our version control tracking yet. So we can fix that by hitting the plus thing here. There's a little link, and you can actually, if you have more than one, you can use the big plus here, but there's only one. And this is known as staging a change. So this means it's getting ready to be committed. So remember, if you think of the commit as sort of like a save point in a video game, this is getting it ready to say, okay, here we're ready to save. Okay, so this is the thing. And the reason you do this item by item is you might, when you're working in a big complex code system, you might only want to mark certain things to commit. Other things aren't ready yet. But anyway, here we go. It's ready. It's added. You can see it says added. And then you want to always have a little message for your commit. So let's say starting version with basic HTML. It's good to have a little message, so it's a way of identifying what you're up to, what changes you put into this particular thing. And when you're ready with the message, you hit this up here, the little commit, and now it's put it away, okay? And if you want, you can actually see, just roll over, view history. Here is my history, and I can go back to this anytime I want, or I can branch from this or whatever. Now we're just at the very beginning. This isn't that big a deal, okay? But for example, if we've typing away and we make some kind of mistake and inadvertently delete a whole bunch of things, and maybe we forgot to close the wrong thing and everything's in the wrong place, and our page is suddenly all weird and we don't know why and it's missing stuff, we're like, oh no, what have I done? Like you can see it's missing everything. We just go to version control, whoops, here. And you see here this little backwards arrow. This means discard changes. So even if you've saved this file and everything, you can hit this and you say you're sure. It's now brought it back to exactly the place it was in the last commit. So this is super useful, as you can imagine. It gives you, it's sort of like training wheels on your bike. You're now safe to go out, make a mess, make mistakes, and anytime you want, you can just roll it back. You don't have to try to remember what you did and try to undo it. You can just roll it right back. And you can do this with a whole project with dozens of files, hundreds of files, and roll them right back to where they were before. And you can eventually just roll back through all the history of all your Git commits and take all my projects that I have all of them in Git, and I can roll all of them back to the very first day that I started writing code on them, even if they're things I've been working on for years, and some of them have thousands of commits. And Git is also really useful for working with teams of people because each person can work locally and then sync them up in a central service. This is known as GitHub is one of the big ones. There's other ones you can get. You can make your own. But for the time being, we're just going to do the simple version where we're working on our own. And this is just allowing us to work without worrying about making mistakes. Okay, so next time we're going to start getting more interesting. We're going to do a little bit of CSS and doing a bit more with Git as well. So hope that was useful, and we'll see you soon.